Chapter 1. Creativity. On a cool fall evening in 2008, 4 students decided to change an industry. They were all deep in debt, and they had all lost or broken their glasses. They were shocked at how much it would cost to replace them. One of them had been wearing the same pair of broken and repaired glasses for 5 years. He refused to pay for an expensive new pair. Luxottica, the biggest company in the glasses industry, controlled more than 80% of the market. To make glasses cheaper, the 4 students would need to fight a giant. The 4 had watched Zappos change the shoe market by selling shoes online, and they wondered if they could do the same with glasses. They discussed the idea with friends, most of whom were very negative. Nobody would buy glasses over the internet, they said. People needed to try them first. OK, Zappos had done it with shoes, but there were reasons why it wouldn't work with glasses. If this were a good idea, people said, someone would have done it already. None of the students had worked in internet sales or technology, and they knew nothing about glasses or fashion. But they agreed to start a company. They decided to sell glasses that would cost $500 in stores for $95 online, and they would also give another pair of glasses to someone in the poorer countries in the developing world for each pair that they sold. They called their company Warby Parker. The most important part of the business would be its website, and their Warby Parker website was ready in February 2010. They expected to sell 1 or 2 pairs of glasses a day, but in less than 1 month they had 20,000 customers on a waiting list. In 2015, the magazine Fast Company published its yearly list of the world's most innovative companies. Warby Parker was the first company on that list. In the 3 previous years, the winners had been Google, Nike and Apple, companies with over 50,000 employees. Warby Parker had just 500 employees, but in 5 years the company had given more than 1 million free pairs of glasses to the developing world. The company was making $100 million a year and was worth more than $1 billion. Back in 2009, one of those 4 students asked me to invest in Warby Parker. I refused. It was the worst financial decision I have ever made. I needed to understand where I went wrong. Conformity and originality. Years ago, psychologists discovered that there are 2 roads to success: conformity and originality. Conformity means following the crowds down the usual paths. Originality means taking unusual roads and developing new ideas that are accepted only by a few people, but that succeed in the end. Of course, nothing is completely original. Our ideas are affected by the world around us. We all borrow thoughts, sometimes by accident, sometimes not. What I mean here by originality is introducing and advancing an idea that is quite unusual in a particular area and may improve that area. Originality begins with creativity, having an idea that is both new and useful. But it doesn't stop there. Originals are people who can make their new idea really work. The Warby Parker people had the originality to think of selling glasses online, but they became originals by taking action to make those glasses cheap and easy to buy. This book is about how we can all become more original. There's a surprising clue in the web browser that you use to search the internet. The problem with defaults. In a recent research project, Michael Hausman was investigating why some people who worked in customer call centers for big companies stayed in their jobs longer than others. He collected information on 30,000 employees who answered phones for banks, airlines, and cell phone companies. He expected to find that their employment histories would give him an answer. He thought people who had changed jobs often in the past would leave their present jobs more quickly. But that wasn't true. Looking at his research, Hausman noticed that his team had collected information about the internet browser that the employees had used when they applied for their job. He didn't think he would find anything interesting there, but the results were amazing. Employees who used Firefox or Chrome stayed in their jobs 15% longer than those who used Internet Explorer or Safari. Hausman thought this was strange, so then he looked at absences from work. Again, Firefox and Chrome users were 19% less likely to miss work than Internet Explorer and Safari users. Then Hausman looked at how employees performed in their jobs. The Firefox and Chrome users had higher sales, and their call times were shorter. Their customers were happier too. Hausman knew it wasn't the web browser that made these people good employees. What made the difference was how they had gotten their browsers. If you buy a PC, Internet Explorer is built into Windows. If you buy a Mac, it comes with Safari. But if you choose to use Firefox or Chrome, you are not accepting the default. It's the same at work. The people who didn't accept the default for their browser did their jobs differently. They didn't always accept the usual answers, and they helped their customers with new ideas. Accepting the default is easy, but it doesn't ask us to look at new ways of doing things. Before the 4 people behind Warby Parker started to think about their company, they knew glasses were expensive, but that had always been true. That was the default. Everybody thought there was a good reason why glasses were expensive. After all, these are health products. A doctor is selling them. Then, Dave Gilboa, one of the 4, was buying an Apple iPhone. Why was this phone, a piece of modern technology, cheaper than a simple pair of glasses? Warby Parker decided to look at the glasses industry more closely. One company, Luxottica, was the biggest in the market. Simply, Luxottica could charge what it wanted, 20 times the cost of the glasses. And this meant that a different company could do things very differently. Accepting defaults. We begin to accept defaults when we are very young. When researchers interviewed school teachers, they asked them to list their favourite and least favourite students. They then asked the teachers which students had the most creativity, and these were often the least favourite students. Teachers found that the creative students often made trouble, while most children learned to do what the teacher wanted. You might think it is the most intelligent children who change the world when they become adults, but that doesn't often happen. They may become excellent doctors, but they don't ask why some people cannot afford healthcare. They may become lawyers who defend people against unfair laws, but they don't question the laws themselves. They may become teachers who teach exciting lessons, but without asking what their students really need to learn. The problem for many intelligent children is that we expect them to achieve. It becomes so important for them to achieve that they start to fear failure, which can hold back creativity. Fear of failure held back some of the most original people in history. People who, instead of pushing ahead with confidence, held themselves back through fear of failure. They only took action because other people persuaded them to do so. The men who signed the American Declaration of Independence were not natural revolutionaries. George Washington just wanted to go back to his farm, and only became involved because John Adams asked him to command the army. "I have used everything in my power to avoid it," Washington wrote in a letter to his wife, Martha, in 1766. 200 years later, Martin Luther King, Jr. wanted to work in the church and as a teacher. But when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man, some people in Montgomery, Alabama, decided to organize a group to support her. At a meeting, someone suggested King as president of the group. King didn't have time to think, and he accepted. He said afterward that if he had had time to think, he would probably have refused. When the church asked Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, he wasn't interested. He didn't want to take on such a huge job and ran away to Florence. But he was asked again and again, and after 2 years he agreed to start work. Nearly 500 years later, in 1977, an investor offered Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak $250,000 to help them start Apple. But the investor demanded that Wozniak leave his job at Hewlett-Packard. Wozniak was afraid to leave his job, and he only agreed when he was encouraged by Steve Jobs, other friends, and his parents. We can only wonder how many Kings, Michelangelos, and Wozniaks had original ideas but were never pushed to develop them. Many of us have ideas to improve our workplaces or schools, but we don't give voice to them. Originality can get you into trouble, and most of us prefer to conform. What are the habits of people who are original and who take action to develop their original ideas? How to be an entrepreneur. To be an original, you need to take big risks. That's what most people think. We admire astronauts like Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, who left the only planet we know and went bravely into space. We admire leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Jr., who risked their lives for the things they believed in. And we admire entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, who dropped out of school and worked in dark garages to develop the products of the future. The word entrepreneur was created by Richard Cantillon, and it means someone who takes risks. When we read about the rise of Warby Parker, we see the 4 friends who started the company as great risk-takers. But is it true? 6 months before Warby Parker started business, Neil Blumenthal, one of the 4 friends, was one of my students. He came to see me because he wanted me to invest in their company. I told him that it was an interesting idea, but I wasn't sure that people would buy glasses online. As it would be difficult to persuade people to buy online, I felt it would need an enormous amount of work to get the company going. And when I discovered what Neil and his friends were planning to do with their own lives, I was even less sure. The first problem was that Neil and his friends were still in school. If they believed in Warby Parker, they should all drop out and work full-time on Warby Parker. "No," said Neil. "We're not sure it's a good idea, and we don't know if we will succeed. We're working on it in our spare time." However, they were all finishing school at the end of the year. So, after that, they could work full-time on the project? "No," said Neil. "If things don't work out, I'm taking a full-time job after I finish school, and so are the others." That was enough for me. I decided not to invest. The Warby Parker friends did not fit my picture of successful entrepreneurs. They weren't prepared to risk everything on one idea. I thought they were going to fail because they didn't want any risk. But in fact, that is why they succeeded. In an interesting piece of research, Joseph Rafi and Ji Feng studied 5,000 entrepreneurs over 14 years. They wanted the answer to one simple question. When people start a business, is it better for them to leave their present job or to stay employed? If you think like most people, you would expect the risk-takers who leave their jobs to be more successful. But the opposite happens. Entrepreneurs who keep their original jobs are 33% less likely to fail than the risk-takers who leave their jobs. If you don't like to take risks and have some doubts about your business, you will build your business more carefully. If you take risks in your life, then you may take risks with your business too. Like Warby Parker, many successful businesses were started by people who did not give up their jobs, at least at the beginning. After inventing the first Apple I computer, Steve Wozniak started Apple with Steve Jobs in 1976, but continued to work for Hewlett-Packard until 1977. Larry Page and Sergey Brin developed a better way to search the Internet in 1996, but didn't stop work on their higher degrees at Stanford University until 1998. They tried to sell Google for less than $2 million in 1997 because their new company was making it difficult to study. Luckily, nobody made an offer. Brian May was doing a higher degree in physics when he started to play guitar in a new band. He continued to study for several years before he started to play full-time for Queen. Stephen King worked in a gas station and as a teacher for 7 years after writing his first story. He finally gave up work a year after his first novel, Carrie, was published. These people were all balancing their risk, taking a big risk in one part of their lives, but playing safe with another. Keeping things safe meant that there was space to be original. And because the entrepreneurs were not taking such a big financial risk, there was more time available. There was less danger of starting the business with a poor quality product in an effort to get the money back quickly. As Malcolm Gladwell wrote in The New Yorker, "Many entrepreneurs take plenty of risks, but those are generally the failed entrepreneurs, not the success stories." From idea to action. Having revealed that successful originals often begin by questioning defaults and balancing risk, the rest of this book is about moving from original ideas to action. I have spent more than 10 years researching originality and studying some of the most successful originals of our time. I want to share with you how we can all be more original without taking too many risks with our personal, financial, and professional lives. I hope that what I have discovered will help people develop their originality and will help leaders develop originality in their organizations. The first part of this book looks at how to manage the risks in developing, recognizing, and pushing forward original ideas. New ideas are risky, and we need to learn how to recognize good ideas and avoid the bad ones. Once you are sure that you have a good idea, the next step is to get other people to understand it. You'll discover how the most popular television show ever nearly didn't get made, and why an entrepreneur told investors the reasons why they shouldn't invest in his company. The second part of this book looks at the choices we need to make when developing original ideas. There are the risks of being first to the market. It's sometimes riskier to move early than it is to be late. Delaying can help entrepreneurs build businesses that are stronger over time, and it can help originals remain creative. I will also look at building coalitions of people to work together, and how, sometimes, it can be useful to work with your enemies. The third part of this book looks at how to develop originality in children, and explains how our family, and others, make us more or less likely to question defaults. You'll see how whether or not baseball players are the first child in a family affects the risks that they take. I'll also look at how leaders can encourage the development of creative ideas in their companies. To finish, I'll look at what stops us from developing our originality. The originals are the people who push us all forward. On the inside, they are not that different from the rest of us. They have the same fears and doubts. What makes them different is that they try even though they have fears and doubts. They know failure is a smaller disappointment than failing to try. Chapter 2. Ideas and Inventors. Around the year 2000, a lot of people in Silicon Valley were very interested in a new invention. Steve Jobs said it was the most exciting technology since the computer. He offered the inventor $63 million to buy 10% of the company. But the inventor wasn't interested. The man behind Amazon, Jeff Bezos, told the inventor, "You have a product so revolutionary you'll have no problem selling it." The inventor was described as a modern Thomas Edison, and he was behind a number of exciting medical inventions. He thought his new invention would have sales of 10,000 a week in its first year. But after 6 years, he had only sold 30,000, and the company still wasn't making money. The invention was expected to change lives and cities around the world, but today it is only used in a few special markets. The revolutionary product was the Segway, a machine with 2 wheels that carries you around. Why did so many people think it was going to be a success? Why did they get it wrong? A few years earlier, 2 writers wrote a 90-minute television program. They had never written for television before, and they soon found they didn't have enough material for 90 minutes, so they decided to write a weekly half-hour show. But when they sent their work to a television company, the people there either didn't like it or didn't understand it. One program was made and shown to a test audience of 100 people. The viewers didn't like it. 600 more people in 4 different cities watched it. The report on those test audiences said nobody in the audience wanted to watch the show again. Surprisingly, the program did make it to television, and, as expected, it wasn't successful. But one person at the television company believed in it, and argued that they should try making some more shows. These were made and shown a year later, and again they weren't popular. The television company were going to cancel the program, but agreed to do a few more shows when another program was cancelled. One of the writers almost left the show. He had no more ideas. It's a good thing he changed his mind. For the next 10 years, the program was one of the most popular on television, and it made more than $1 billion. TV Guide named it the greatest television program of all time. Why did the television companies not believe in Seinfeld? When we say there is not enough originality in the world, we think it is because there is not enough creativity. We think that if only people had more new ideas, we would be better off. But the real problem is not new ideas, it's selecting the right ideas. Our companies and countries have many people with new ideas. What they don't have are people who can choose the right new ideas. Segway was a false positive. People thought it would be a success, but it wasn't. Seinfeld was a false negative. People expected it to fail, but it succeeded. This chapter is about selecting the right ideas. We'll look at two people who did expect the Segway to fail, and at the one person in the television company who believed in Seinfeld. We'll see how these people made the right decisions, and how we can become better at choosing the right ideas. Judging creativity. The inventor of the Segway was a brilliant man called Dean Kamen. He had started inventing when he was 16, and some of his inventions were very successful. In the 1990s, he designed the iBot, a wheelchair that could climb stairs. He realized that the technology of the iBot could be used more widely, and he put together a team to design the Segway. He wanted something that would be safe, friendly for the environment, and would help people to move around busy cities. Because it was small, light, and easy to ride, it would be great for mail carriers, police officers, and golfers. But it could also change the way everybody travelled. The Segway was the most amazing technology he had ever created. Kamen thought it would replace the car, in the same way that the car had replaced the horse. But inventors are not the best people to judge their own inventions. Studies show that most of us are bad at judging ourselves. For example, 70% of high school seniors think they are above-average leaders. 2% think they are below average. 94% of college professors think their work is above average. In two different companies, 32% and 42% of engineers estimated they were in the top 5% in their work. When we have developed an idea, we are usually too close to it to judge it accurately. In music, many experts think Beethoven was a good critic of his own music. But Beethoven's own favourite pieces have not been the ones played most. Aaron Cosbelt looked at letters where Beethoven judged 70 of his works and compared Beethoven's estimates with those of other experts. Of those 70 works, Beethoven estimated 15 false positives, works that he thought were important but that are not, and 8 false negatives, works that he thought unsuccessful but that are now judged very highly. That's 33% wrong, even though Beethoven was judging his work after audiences had heard and judged it. Kissing frogs. If originals are not good at judging their own work, how do they create great products? They have a lot of ideas. Dean Simonton has looked at many really successful creators and discovered that they didn't have better ideas than others, they had more. By producing more ideas, they had a better chance of originality. Think about William Shakespeare. In 20 years, he wrote 37 plays and 154 poems. In order to judge how popular they were, Simonton looked at how often the plays were performed. 3 of Shakespeare's 5 most popular plays, Macbeth, King Lear, and Othello, were written in the same 5 years that he wrote Timon of Athens and All's Well That Ends Well, which many people feel are among the worst of his plays. Pablo Picasso produced more than 1,800 paintings, 12,000 drawings, and thousands of other works, but only a small number of these are widely admired. Albert Einstein published 248 papers over his life, but most of them are not considered important. We know Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise, and her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, but we forget about her other 165 poems and 6 books. If you want to be original, the most important possible thing you could do, says Ira Glass, is do a lot of work. Many people think that if you want to do better work, you should do less and spend time on delivering high-quality work. But having a lot of ideas is the best way to get to quality. Original thinkers will have many ideas that are of no use, but because they develop so many ideas, it is more likely some of them will be successful. When he was developing the Segway, Dean Kamen knew it was important to explore as many ideas as possible. You've got to kiss a lot of frogs, he would say to his team, before you find a prince. He encouraged them to look at hundreds of different ways of solving the problems they met. The problem was that he decided to develop the Segway without knowing whether, in the end, it would be a frog or a prince. One of the best ways of judging our ideas is to get feedback. One of the writers of The Daily Show, Liz Winstead, still doesn't know, after years of working on the comedy program, what will make people laugh. In the past, she would try jokes out on stage to an audience. Some jokes made people laugh, some didn't. Now, with social media, she can get feedback more quickly. When she thinks of a joke, she shares it on Twitter. When she has something longer to share, she uses Facebook. At the end of the day, the feedback tells her whether an idea is worth developing or not. When developing the Segway, Dean Kamen didn't look for feedback. He was afraid that somebody would steal his idea, so he kept the program secret. Many of his own employees weren't allowed to see the Segway while it was being developed. So the team working on the Segway developed a huge number of ideas, but they didn't get any feedback from customers. No customers saw it when it was being developed. But Kamen and his team weren't the only people who were enthusiastic about the Segway. Why did Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos make the same mistake? To find the answer to that question, let's first look at why so many people were wrong about Seinfeld. The danger of false negatives. When the television company first looked at Seinfeld, they didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't like other television programs. They didn't want to take a risk on something new like this. It would be better to develop a safe idea than take a risk on this new one. This way of thinking produces false negatives. The false negative is something that happens often in the media. Film companies rejected movies like Star Wars, E.T., and Pulp Fiction. Publishers refused books like The Diary of Anne Frank, Gone with the Wind, and Harry Potter. By 2015, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter books had brought in over $25 billion and sold more copies than any book series ever. And in business, there are hundreds of examples where employees were ordered to stop work on projects that were later successful. The Xbox was almost stopped by Microsoft, and the laser printer was nearly cancelled by Xerox because it was too expensive. When we see something unusual, we often refuse it and look for reasons why it may fail. When managers see something new, they compare it to things that were successful in the past. So, some publishers thought Harry Potter was too long for a children's book, and television company managers thought Seinfeld was too much about New York to be of interest to the rest of the country. Test audiences are no better than managers at judging new television shows. They make the same mistakes. When you watch a show at home, in your living room, you get interested in the story. If you laugh a lot, at the end you will think it was funny. But in a test audience, you don't watch in the same way. You know you are there to judge it, and so you compare it with shows you know are funny. Neither test audiences nor managers are a good way of deciding whether a show is funny or not. Wide experience and deep experience. When the test audiences were negative about Seinfeld, the project nearly stopped. But one man, Rick Ludwin, believed in it. Rick Ludwin worked on special programs, not comedy, so Seinfeld wasn't his department. But because his experience was in a different type of television, he felt differently about the project. Most comedy programs before Seinfeld had a few complete stories, with endings, inside 22 minutes of television. Seinfeld started a lot more stories, but sometimes didn't finish them. That worried most television managers, but Ludwin worked on specials, where each program is organized in its own way. Ludwin had written jokes for Bob Hope in the 1970s and had worked on comedies in the past. Because Ludwin had some experience of comedy, he understood how it worked. And, although he hadn't worked in comedy for many years, he had a wide experience of television, and he was happy to explore new ways of making people laugh. He combined a wide experience of television outside of comedy with a deep experience of comedy from his days writing jokes. And combining wide and deep experience is very important for creativity. A recent study looked at every Nobel Prize-winning scientist from 1901 to 2005 and compared them with other scientists who had not won Nobel Prizes. Both groups knew their science well. They had deep experience. But the Nobel Prize winners were more likely to be doing other artistic things as well. Here's what the 15 researchers at Michigan State University found when they compared the Nobel Prize winners with the other scientists. Artistic activity, Nobel Prize winners compared to other scientists. Music, 2 times more likely. Drawing, painting, etc., 7 times more likely. Wood or metal working, mechanics, electronics, etc., 7.5 times more likely. Writing, poems, plays, novels, etc., 12 times more likely. performing, acting, dancing, etc., 22 times more likely. A study of thousands of Americans showed similar results for entrepreneurs and inventors. These people were more likely than others to take part in activities like drawing, painting, or writing. In a study of the fashion industry, a team of researchers led by Frédéric Godard looked at the cultural experience of fashion designers. The most creative work came from designers who had worked in foreign countries, but Godard found 3 especially interesting things about this experience. Firstly, living in a foreign country didn't help creativity. It was working there that was important. The most original work came from designers who had worked in 2 or 3 different countries. Secondly, the more foreign the country, the better. For an American, working in Canada didn't help a lot. Working in Korea or Japan helped more with originality. Thirdly, the experience was better if it was deep. A few weeks wasn't useful. The most creative designers had spent 35 years working in other countries. Where Steve Jobs went wrong. When Steve Jobs first got on a Segway, he refused to climb off. When Dean Kamen wanted other investors to try it, Jobs let them, but soon got back on again. He invited Kamen to dinner and told him his Segway was as original as the computer, and he wanted to be involved. Steve Jobs was famous for making decisions through intuition, rather than investigating carefully. Why did he get it wrong this time? There were 3 main reasons. He didn't have experience of this area of business. He felt too confident because of his success in other areas of business, and he was very enthusiastic. Let's start with experience. Jobs and the other early investors in Segway, like Jeff Bezos, knew nothing about transportation. They were originals in their area, but that did not make them good in other areas. Intuition can be helpful, but it works best when we have experience of what we are looking at. The Segway was a brilliant machine, and it was huge fun to ride it. But it was difficult for people with no transportation experience to judge it. One man who did understand the problems with Segway was Randy Komisar. He looked at the transportation market and realized that the Segway wasn't going to replace the car. It would replace walking or cycling. But he didn't think it was a product many people would want. It was exciting to ride, but it was a lot of money to pay for something that replaced walking. And at that time, nobody knew whether governments would allow it on sidewalks. Komisar thought there would be a market in mail or police services or for golfers. But Jobs still thought that Segway was too exciting to fail. Jobs' next problem was that he had been very successful in one area of business, so he thought he understood all areas of business. The more successful people are in the past, the worse they perform when they work in a new area. He was so sure his intuition was right that he didn't check his intuition with people who understood transportation. When Kamen talked with investors like Jobs about Segway, he spoke about countries like China and India, which were building cities the size of New York every year. These cities would be full of cars, and that would be really bad for the environment. He was enthusiastic, and the investors liked that enthusiasm. When we look at a new idea, the enthusiasm of the inventor can make a big difference. Enthusiasm is important for inventors, but entrepreneurs need to be more careful. Thoughts on selecting ideas. My failure to invest in Warby Parker was a big false negative. I had never owned glasses, so it was hard for me to think about people who did. I had deep experience of glasses. I had spent 2 years doing research in a company that made and sold glasses through stores, but I didn't have wide experience. 3 of the 4 men behind Warby Parker wore glasses, and the 4th, Neil Blumenthal, had worked for 5 years in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, helping women to start businesses. One of the businesses he helped with was selling glasses, so he knew that glasses could be made much more cheaply than people think. The Warby Parker entrepreneurs were also careful to get everybody in the company involved in development. Nothing was secret, and ideas were shared on a Google document where everybody in the company could read them. And people could give feedback on new ideas as they appeared. If Segway had done the same as Warby Parker, they may have avoided some of their problems. But Kamen is still a great inventor, especially in the area of healthcare. As an inventor, he should be having the great ideas, but then sharing them with others and getting feedback on which inventions are the most useful. In 2013, 300,000 patents were taken out in the United States. The chances that any of these inventions will change the world are tiny. One creative inventor with lots of inventions has a better chance that one invention over his or her whole life will make a difference. And when we judge these inventors, we don't look at their least successful ones, we look at the best. Chapter 3. Speaking the Truth. In the early 1990s, a CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, employee called Carmen Medina worked in Europe for 3 years. When she returned to the United States, she found that leaving the United States had made it difficult to get an interesting job in the CIA, and she began to look for other ways to help the organization. During the time she worked for the CIA in Europe, she had noticed that there was a big problem with information sharing in the organization. Information was shared by finished intelligence reports, which were sent out once a day. The experts who wrote them had no way of sharing ideas before the reports went out. Things change very quickly in intelligence, and it was taking too long for the right information to reach the right people. Carmen Medina suggested that, instead of using printed paper documents, departments could put their ideas immediately onto Interlink, a secret internet used by the CIA. Her managers weren't interested. The internet was dangerous, and intelligence had to be secret. With printed documents, you could be sure the right people had the right information. It would be very dangerous if the wrong people got secret information. Medina kept talking about her idea, but everybody told her to be quiet. Finally, she decided to leave the CIA, but she couldn't find another job. She ended up working in a boring CIA desk job, and she kept quiet about her idea for a while. 3 years later, she decided to argue again for online information sharing. Less than 10 years later, Carmen Medina was involved in creating Intellipedia, a Wikipedia for intelligence organizations. It allowed departments to read reports from other organizations. It was a big change to the secret culture of the CIA, and it helped with intelligence for the Beijing Olympics and after the Mumbai attacks in 2008. In a few years, Intellipedia had 500,000 users and over 1 million pages. It achieved this very quickly and very cheaply too. Why did Medina fail the first time she talked about information sharing, and why was she heard the second time? In between, the world had changed. The Internet was much more widely used, and the attacks of September 11, 2001 made it clear that intelligence organizations needed to be better at sharing information. Medina had also become Deputy Director of Intelligence at the CIA, which gave her the power to follow her idea. She got that position by learning to speak in ways that made people listen to her and believe her. We have all sometimes wanted to speak about something that seems wrong either inside or outside of an organization. This chapter is about how to do this well and without risks. What are the right times to speak, and how can we make sure people hear us? As well as Carmen Medina, we'll hear about an entrepreneur who tells investors why they shouldn't invest in his companies, a manager who argued with Steve Jobs, and why managers who appear to support you sometimes provide the least support. We'll also see how gender and race affect our ability to be heard, and why the photos we like of ourselves are the opposite of the ones we like of our friends. Power without status. Leaders and managers like it when employees offer help, do research, or ask for feedback. But there's one thing that is not so popular: making suggestions. In one piece of research in an industry, it was found that the more employees made suggestions to their managers, the less likely they were to get promoted. To understand what happens in organizations when people like Carmen Medina object to something, we need to think about power and status. Power is being able to control what other people do. Status is being admired by other people. When people without status make suggestions, we don't think they should tell us what to do, and we refuse. That is what happened to Carmen Medina. Her years working outside of the United States meant she had low status. She hadn't been able to show people what she could really do, so people didn't value her ideas. Years later, she had earned status because she had slowly gotten jobs with more responsibility in the organization. Then she got a job where she had to protect sensitive information. Now, when she talked about sharing information, it was part of her job. People saw that she stood for something and not against it. They started to admire her work, and this made it possible for her ideas to be seen as original. We don't like originality in low-status people, but we admire it when their status is high. The Saric effect. After having their first child, Rufus Griscom and Alisa Volkman were shocked by the false advertising and bad advice being offered to parents. They started an online magazine called Babel that aimed to tell the truth about being a parent. In 2009, when Griscom tried to get investors for the project, he did the opposite to what every entrepreneur is taught to do. He told the investors the top 5 reasons for not investing in his business. That should have killed the idea. Investors are looking for reasons to say yes, and he was giving them reasons to say no. Entrepreneurs are supposed to talk about the great things in the company, and he was doing the opposite. But it worked. That year, Babel got $3.3 million from investors. 2 years later, Griscom went to see Disney to see if they were interested in buying Babbel. He did the same thing again and told them, "Here's why you should not buy Babbel." Then he explained that people who looked at the Babbel website didn't stay very long. And Babbel was supposed to be for parents, but 40% of the messages people wrote on it weren't about parents at all. What's more, the technology behind the website needed some serious work. Disney bought the company for $40 million. This is called the Saric effect, after Leslie Saric. Griscom was talking to people who had more power than him. He was asking them to give him money. Usually you would tell people what was good about your project, but that only works when people are already on your side. When you're talking to investors, they are looking for reasons why your idea won't work. In that situation, it may be better to talk about what is wrong with your idea. Here are 4 reasons why the Saric effect can work. First, beginning with what is weak about a business helps to put the audience on your side. When we know somebody is trying to push us into buying something, we usually refuse. But when Griscom said the words, "Here's why you shouldn't buy this company," they laughed and then relaxed. He had given them a problem to solve. Second, talking about what is wrong with an idea makes you look intelligent. People who say and write negative things are usually seen to be more intelligent than people who say and write positive things. When you say something negative about an idea, it shows you have thought about it. In Griscom's case, it showed he knew there were problems and he wasn't trying to hide them. Third, talking about the problems with your business means that investors will trust you more. When Griscom talked about his problems, it made him look honest. Of course, talking about the problems doesn't work if your audience doesn't know about them, but Griscom's audiences were going to give him a lot of money. They were looking at his business very carefully, so he couldn't hide the problems anyway. They would find them. Also, investors thought that if he was admitting what was wrong with his business, there was probably a lot that was right. Fourth, audiences are more likely to support an idea when the problems are made clear. When Griscom told investors about the problems with the business, it made it difficult for them to think of other problems with it, and they began to think that maybe Griscom's problems weren't too bad. The unfamiliarity problem. When you have spent weeks, months, or even years thinking about your idea, you know it perfectly. It's not possible to imagine what the idea sounds like to someone who is hearing it for the first time. So, we often present our ideas to people without enough information. If we want people to accept our original ideas, we need to speak about them often and then repeat what we said. To illustrate, which of these 2 words do you like better? Iktitaf, Saric. If you're like most people, you will choose Saric. Robert Zions has described this. He showed people nonsense words like Iktitaf and Saric and asked them which they preferred. If they had never seen either word before, they liked them equally. But when they had seen one of the words twice before the test, they preferred that one. And if they had seen it 5, 10, or 25 times, they liked it even more. I used Saric 4 times earlier. There is nothing called the Saric effect, and there is nobody called Leslie Saric. I invented them to show how seeing the word already can affect you. Rufus Griscom is real, however, and so is everyone else in this book. My favourite test of this is when people looked at photographs of themselves and their friends. Some of the photos were inverted, as though in a mirror, and some were not. People liked the photos of their friends when they weren't inverted, because that's how they are used to seeing them. But they preferred photos of themselves that were inverted, because we're used to seeing ourselves in the mirror. One reason for this is that the idea or picture we're used to is easier to understand. Something that we don't know takes more effort, and that makes us uncomfortable. Making people uncomfortable. When Carmen Medina made no progress the first time she talked about information sharing, she thought about leaving the CIA. She stayed, but she didn't speak up to her managers again about her ideas for a long time. When she did, it was because of her manager, Mike. I guessed Mike would be a friendly, relaxed man, but he was the opposite. He was not friendly, and he got angry quickly. So why was he the right manager for Medina? Although he was a difficult man, Mike did care about the future of the organization. Friendly people like everyone around them to be happy, so they are less likely to push difficult ideas forward. A man like Mike didn't mind making people uncomfortable, so he was ready to give Medina time to develop her uncomfortable ideas. Another thing that Medina noticed was that middle managers were the most unhappy with her ideas. It is often the people in the middle who don't want to make difficulties. They have made some progress in the organization and don't want to go backward. The difficulties of speaking up. Speaking up to an audience of middle managers is always a risk, but it was especially difficult for Carmen Medina, because she was a woman in an organization where most of the employees were men. I thought the days when women could not speak up in work were in the past, but I soon realized there is still a problem with gender. In organizations around the world, people expect men to speak up and to lead. But when women speak up, they can be seen as angry. When I looked at my own research, I was very disappointed. In an international bank and a healthcare company, I found that suggesting good ideas led to promotions for men, but not for women. Other research shows that male employees who talk more than others are rewarded and promoted, but women who talk more are judged negatively by both men and women. When women suggest changing something at work to improve it, their bosses don't trust them and are not as likely to change anything. There is no doubt things were difficult for Medina because she was a woman in an organization of mostly men. But she was also a Puerto Rican. Being from two groups like this makes a difference. Ashley Rosette, an African-American researcher, found that people behaved differently when she spoke up than when white women and black men did. When black women leaders failed, they were judged harder than black men or than white men and women. The road not taken. In 1985, Donna Dubinsky was working as Apple's distribution and sales manager. It was a busy job, as sales of Apple computers were increasing quickly. Then Steve Jobs suggested that Apple stop using its 6 distribution centers and move to just-in-time distribution. Computers would be finished in the factory when they were needed and would be delivered to customers direct from the factory. Dubinsky thought this was a big mistake. She knew that Apple's success depended on successful distribution. She objected, but nobody listened. For several months, she worked in a group that looked at just-in-time distribution. Everyone seemed happy to go ahead with a new just-in-time system, except Dubinsky. She spoke up against the idea and told Apple they must give her 30 days to create a different system, and if they didn't give it to her, she would leave. She was taking a big risk, but she was given the time. At the end of the 30 days, she suggested a new distribution system, and it was accepted. People knew she had done a good job in the past. She had status. Many people would think that arguing with Steve Jobs, known as a difficult man, would not be a good idea. But Jobs liked people who argued with him, and he was open to new ways of doing things. And Dubinsky wasn't doing it for herself. She was doing it for Apple. Jobs understood that. In 1991, Dubinsky left Apple. She met Jeff Hawkins and joined Palm Computing, which produced the Palm Pilot, one of the first small handheld computers. But when Palm was bought by 3Com, she was again unhappy with the management. She and Hawkins left to start a new company, Handspring, which made handheld computers and developed a smartphone. A few years later, Apple developed the iPhone. Medina had wanted to leave the CIA but couldn't. That was why she stayed and, in the end, changed the organization from the inside. Dubinsky did leave and helped to begin the smartphone revolution. Although Medina stayed and Dubinsky left, they both chose to speak up rather than remain silent. Chapter 4. Taking Time. Late at night in a hotel room, a young man stared at an empty piece of paper on the desk. Nervously, he called a friend in a room several floors down to talk through some ideas. The friend ran up the stairs to discuss a speech that would change history. At 3 a.m., the young man was still working. It was August 1963, and although he expected to speak to 100,000 people in Washington the next day, Martin Luther King Jr. still hadn't finished his speech. He worked on it all night, not sleeping, King's wife Coretta remembered. He was to be the final speaker, and his words would be carried on television and radio to millions of people in America and across the world. The speech had been announced 2 months earlier, and King knew how important it would be. It would only be 5 minutes long, so he had to be very careful in choosing his words. You might think he would begin writing the speech immediately, as soon as he knew about it, but he didn't begin writing until 10 p.m. the night before. Parents and teachers usually ask children to begin work on their homework early, instead of waiting until the last minute. But maybe it was because King procrastinated that he gave the best speech of his life. I've studied originals for a long time, and I've learned that arriving early is not always a good thing. It's sometimes better to arrive at the last minute. This chapter looks at the question of when to take original action. I'll discuss how delaying can be useful and why procrastinating can be a good thing. I'll look at how entrepreneurs who are first to market with a product can have difficulties, why older innovators are sometimes better than younger ones, and how leaders who want to change things wait patiently for the right time. You don't have to be first to be an original. You don't even have to arrive on time. Originals are often late to the party. Great procrastinators. Recently, a student of mine, Ji-Hai Shin, came to me with an interesting idea. Procrastinating might be good for originality. When you procrastinate, you may be thinking about the thing you have to do, but you delay doing it. Shin wondered whether the delay meant that you had time to think about a number of different possibilities, rather than just one idea. As a result, you may have more original ideas. I asked her to test her theory. There was an empty building at college where there had been a small food store. Shin asked students to write ideas for using the empty space. When the students started work immediately, most of their ideas weren't very original. They suggested things like another food store. But Shin asked some students to procrastinate by giving them computer games to play first. The business ideas these students produced were more original. The ideas from the procrastinators were 28% more original. We were excited by these results, but wondered whether playing the games had helped creativity. But when people played games before they were asked for ideas, it didn't help originality. It also didn't help to start work, then stop and take a break, and then return to work. Once the students had started work, they had made too much progress to stop and start again. They had to know what was wanted, and to procrastinate, in order to have the most creative ideas. Shin then did some more research, looking at a Korean furniture company. Managers thought employees who procrastinated a lot were more original than those who didn't. But procrastinating wasn't always a good thing. If the employees weren't really determined to solve a big problem, delaying just made things late. But when they were excited about looking for new ideas, procrastination helped a lot. Leonardo da Vinci was a famous procrastinator. Experts think he took 16 years to paint the Mona Lisa, stopping and starting many times. He also spent 15 years thinking about the Last Supper, working on many other things at the same time. In American history, there may be only one speech as famous as King's, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In just 272 words, Lincoln made clear that the Civil War was about freedom and equality. Lincoln was invited to give the speech 2 weeks earlier. By the day before, he had only written about half of the speech. He didn't write the last paragraph until the night before, and he didn't finish it until the morning. He waited because he wanted to be sure the speech was right. In the summer before his "I Have a Dream" speech, King got advice from 3 people about what he should say and how. He also discussed the speech for a long time with Clarence Jones, who had written some of his other speeches. Jones and another man began to write some ideas for the speech. King waited until the last 4 days before he began to work on the speech. Then, the night before, he met with his advisers, and they started again. By delaying the work on the speech, King was giving an example of the Zeigarnik effect. The Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik showed that people remember unfinished things better than finished things. Once something is finished, we stop thinking about it. But if it's not finished, it is still there in our minds. When King finally asked Jones to write the complete speech, he had a wide range of ideas. But that wasn't the only good thing about procrastinating. I Have a Dream. 50 years after King's famous speech, we can all remember 4 words: "I have a dream." I was very surprised when I looked at the speech King had written, and the words were not there. Jones didn't put them in, and King did not add them. While he was speaking, the singer Mahalia Jackson was behind him. She shouted, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He continued with his speech, but she shouted it again. In front of a crowd of 250,000, with millions more watching on television, King pushed his notes to one side and talked about his dream. According to Drew Hansen in his book The Dream, King was still cutting out lines and writing new ones just before he started to speak. He was even making changes as he walked up to give the speech. And he didn't read the words exactly. He changed things slightly, like a jazz musician. It was 11 minutes into the speech that he started to talk about his dream, and he added so much to the speech that he spoke for much longer than expected. King had procrastinated, but he had given more than 350 speeches in the year before the I Have a Dream speech. He had material in his head that he could use when he needed it. He put his speeches together from pieces of all his other speeches. Pioneers and Settlers. After working on starting over 100 new companies, Bill Gross did some research to find out why some companies succeeded and others failed. The biggest reasons were not the quality of the ideas, the people in the team, or the amount of money invested. The number one thing was timing, Gross said. 42% of the difference between success and failure was timing. Most Americans believe it is better to be the first mover. We want to be leaders, not followers. If you are the first to market with a new product, you can learn about the market more quickly and get the most customers. By doing that, you stop the competition, because it will be hard to persuade those customers to change. In a famous study, researchers Peter Golder and Gerard Tellis compared the success of companies that were either pioneers or settlers. Pioneers were the first movers, the first company to make or sell a product. The settlers arrived later. They waited for the pioneers to create a market first. When Golder and Tellis looked at hundreds of products in more than 30 different areas of business, they found a huge difference in failures. 47% for pioneers and just 8% for settlers. And even when the pioneers did survive, they only got around 10% of the market, compared with 28% for settlers. Surprisingly, the problems for the first mover are often huge. Pioneers may sometimes get a big part of the market, but they usually have a big risk of not surviving, and they often don't make much money. If you're thinking of moving into a new area of business, you need to stop and think about timing. But researcher Lisa Bolton found something more frightening. Even when entrepreneurs know it is risky to be the first mover, they don't believe it. We can all think of pioneers who succeeded, and we've forgotten those who failed. So what are the reasons that settlers do better than pioneers? First, many people think that settlers are just copying the pioneers, but that isn't really true. They may be waiting before introducing something new. They may be working on something that is better than the products in the market now. In home video games, the pioneer was Magnavox Odyssey, which started with simple sports games in 1972. A settler, Nintendo, started to manage the distribution for Odyssey in Japan in 1975, and then, in the 1980s, started to sell the Nintendo Entertainment System, with games like Super Mario Bros. Nintendo's games improved on the older games. It was easier to play them, and the characters were interesting. You don't have to be first to be original. You have to be different and better. In the 1990s, a banker, Joseph Park, was at home in his apartment. He was annoyed because he wanted to stay home and watch a movie, but to do that, he had to go out to a store and rent one. Why couldn't he go to a website, choose a movie, and have it delivered to his door? As there didn't seem to be a company that provided this service, Park decided to create one. Although Park collected $250 million from investors, his company, Cosmo, only survived until 2001. The biggest mistake was that Cosmo promised to deliver movies in 1 hour, and spent a lot of money on distribution to try and make that possible. If Park had moved more slowly, he might have realized that delivering movies in an hour wasn't going to work. A lot of people wanted online movies, and Netflix was just beginning. Maybe Cosmo could have competed with movies by mail, and then it might have been able to move to delivery online. Second, it seems that people who choose to move late may be better suited to succeed. Risk-takers like to move first, and they may make their decisions too quickly. Entrepreneurs who want to avoid risk watch the market and wait for the right time. In research into software companies, Elizabeth Pontiquez and William Barnett found that when entrepreneurs waited for the market to cool down, they were more likely to succeed. Third, as well as avoiding some risk, settlers can look at their competitors' products and make their own products better. When you are first, you have to make all the mistakes yourself. Settlers can watch you and learn from your mistakes. Fourth, pioneers often stay with the first products they sell. Settlers can watch how the market changes and change their products so they remain right for the changing market. Settlers can also wait for the market to be ready for them. When Warby Parker started, people had been selling products online for 10 years, even though the idea hadn't worked before for glasses. The theory of pioneers and settlers is true outside of the world of business as well. In the 1840s, the Hungarian doctor Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that if medical students washed their hands, the number of women patients who died giving birth was much lower. Other doctors laughed at him. He became sick and died a young man. 20 years later, the research of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch showed Semmelweis to be right. I don't want to say that it is never good to be first. If we all wait for someone else to move first, nothing original will ever be created. Someone has to be the pioneer, and sometimes they are successful. This is often true when there is a patent behind the product, or when a product becomes more valuable as more people use it, such as social media. But, in most cases, the chances of success are not higher if you move first. And when the market is not clear or unknown, then being a pioneer is a huge risk. The lesson here is that if you have an original idea, it's a mistake to think you must move first before your competitors. Procrastinating can make it easier to achieve something, and in the same way, Delaying market entry can give us the chance to learn more and reduce risk. But what happens if we take a wider view than ideas and products? If we look at the whole life of a person, is there a risk in waiting too long? Conceptual and experimental. It is widely believed that originality is something we find in young people. Vinod Khosla said at the National Association of Software and Services Companies Product Conclave in 2011, "People under 35 are the people who make change happen. People over 45 die in terms of new ideas." Albert Einstein also said that a scientist had to make his discoveries before the age of 30. And it is true that people do often lose their originality over time. But this doesn't always happen. When companies have suggestion boxes, it seems that older employees have more and better ideas than younger employees, with the highest value ideas coming from employees over 55. And in new technology companies, the average age of entrepreneurs is 38. In art and science, David Gallinson shows that we're quick to remember the exciting young people, but there are a lot of older people who succeed much later. In film, for example, Orson Welles made Citizen Kane when he was 25. Alfred Hitchcock made his 3 greatest films when he was much older, at ages 59, Vertigo, 60, North by Northwest, and 61, Psycho. Why are some people creative early, while others start to be creative later? The creative age depends on the way we think. When Gallinson studied creativity, he discovered 2 very different types of thinking, conceptual and experimental. Conceptual people think of a big idea and try to achieve it. Experimental people work by trying different things, some of which succeed, while some don't. They are thinking about a problem, but they don't think about the answer to the problem when they start work. They don't plan. They decide things as they work. Gallinson believes conceptual thinkers move quickly, while experimental thinkers take longer. He studied economists who had won the Nobel Prize, and discovered that, on average, the conceptual economists had done their best work at 43, while the experimental economists had done theirs at 61. A study of physicists who had won the Nobel Prize discovered that half of those under 30 were conceptual, while 92% of those over 45 did experimental work. Conceptual people can work quickly because they don't need to do years of careful research. They are also usually young, because young people find it easier to approach a problem in a new way. But as they get older, they find it more difficult, and they become less original. This was Einstein's problem. His most important discoveries were made in his head. They were ideas that explained things that had been discovered by experimental scientists. As he got older, he found it more difficult to work with some of the newer ideas in physics. Conceptual people have ideas earlier, but then they risk copying themselves and producing very similar ideas. Being experimental takes longer, but it means the scientist or artist is able to discover new ideas. Mark Twain published Adventures of Huckleberry Finn when he was 49, changing the story as he wrote it. When he started, he didn't know how it was going to end. As we get older, it helps to be more experimental. Leonardo da Vinci was experimental, taking years to finish his greatest paintings. Martin Luther King Jr., too, was experimental, giving thousands of speeches and changing them as he did so. Moving quickly is fine for the young, and creativity can be both conceptual and experimental. But slow and thoughtful can often work better for the older person. Chapter 5. How to Build Coalitions. Many people have forgotten her, but no one did more for women's suffrage in America than Lucy Stone. She was the first woman in America to keep her own name after getting married. She was the first woman in Massachusetts to earn a college degree. She was the first American lecturer in women's rights. She was one of only a very few women who spoke in public at all. She started the country's leading women's newspaper, the Woman's Journal, which was published for 50 years. In 1851, Stone organized a women's rights meeting, but she wasn't persuaded to speak until the last day. In her speech, she suggested that women should ask the government for the right to vote and to own houses and land. Her speech became known for pushing the women's rights movement forward. Her words were read by John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill in England, who later published a famous letter about women's rights. After the speech, two other great women, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, joined Stone, and together they worked for women's suffrage. But, a long time before they reached their goal, the three women broke apart. In 1869, Anthony and Stanton left Stone's organization and started their own. Working separately, the two organizations had little success, and the arguments between the three women made many people think women weren't able to be leaders. When Stanton and Anthony wrote a book about the history of the women's rights movement, Stone's name wasn't mentioned. If all three leaders wanted the same thing, why did they fight so bitterly? This chapter looks at how originals build coalitions to reach their goals, and how to solve the problems that can lead to coalitions failing. Coalitions can do a lot, but they can also break apart easily because they depend on people's relationships. We will look at the difficulties of coalitions, at an entrepreneur's battle to persuade people to try her idea, at a Disney movie that almost didn't get made, and at how Occupy Wall Street failed. You will see how building good coalitions requires a lot of work. The important lesson is the Goldilocks theory of coalitions, which looks at the ideas within groups as too hot, too cold, or just right. The originals who start a coalition are often the most enthusiastic people in it, and sometimes their ideas are too hot for others. It's sometimes necessary to cool the message to encourage other groups to join the coalition. The message needs to be neither too hot nor too cold. It needs to be just right. Groups that break. We would expect that having similar goals holds groups together, but very often these goals drive groups apart. Even though people share the same goals, some groups push their ideas further, and these groups are often very critical of those who are less enthusiastic. In one study, vegetarians, who don't eat meat, and vegans, who don't eat meat or any other animal products like milk or eggs, gave their opinions about one another. Vegans disliked vegetarians 3 times as much as vegetarians disliked vegans. The vegans with the strongest opinions thought that vegetarians were weak. If they really cared about animals, they wouldn't eat animal products like eggs. The more strongly you feel about something, the more you want to show you are different from people who have some of your goals but who don't push their ideas as far as you do. This is why Anthony and Stanton broke away from Lucy Stone. They wanted to push things further. Things got really bad when Anthony and Stanton argued against giving African American men the vote. If women couldn't vote, they said, these men shouldn't be able to vote either. Stone did not agree. She wanted suffrage for African Americans. Anthony and Stanton were very angry. They thought Stone was not serious about women's suffrage, and they started their own women's suffrage organization. Stone tried to calm things down, but for 20 years their two groups worked separately, sometimes even against one another. Now they were two separate groups. They needed to find new people to help them and form new coalitions. They all found help from an unexpected group, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a women's group that was trying to stop people drinking alcohol. Men who drank alcohol were often violent with their wives, and their families became poor. But the WCTU members were very different from the women's suffrage groups. They were often women from rich, usually very religious families who did not support modern ideas. Yet the groups managed to work together. Many people across the country disliked the idea of women's suffrage, and it's a surprise that the WCTU was happy to work with groups who were pushing for it. But they did make progress, and in several states, women achieved the right to vote. The following example of a young creative entrepreneur shows how business coalitions can be built successfully. Building and breaking coalitions. In 2011, a student called Meredith Perry realized that there was a big problem with the world of technology. She didn't need a wire to make a phone call or connect to the internet. Everything was wireless. Except for one thing. To use her phone and her computer, she still had to connect them to the wall to charge them. She wanted wireless electricity. She thought about things that can send energy through the air, like radio waves, but they wouldn't work well for electricity. What about ultrasound? You can't see ultrasound, and it is silent. Could it be used to carry electrical energy without wires? Her physics teachers said it was impossible. So did ultrasound engineers. A lot of important people told her she was wasting her time. Then she won an invention competition. But as an entrepreneur on her own, with no money, she needed help. 3 years later, I met Meredith Perry. She had managed to get $750,000 from investors, and she had the first example of a wireless charger. It could charge things faster than a wire and over longer distances, and it would be in the stores in 2 years. By the end of 2014, her company, U-Beam, had 18 patents, and investors had given it $10 million. Every single person that is now working for the company didn't think it was possible, she said. Perry had had the same difficulty that all originals have when they want to do something different. Most people don't want to change things. She had talked to a lot of experts, and they all told her about the problems in her math and her physics. In the end, she realized there was a problem with her message. She had been saying, "I'm trying to build something that can send electricity through the air." Instead, she said, "I'm looking for someone to make a part for this new product. Can you help?" This worked. By breaking up the project into parts, she found people who would design those parts. Soon she had people working on the project. She stopped talking about the most exciting part of her idea, the wireless electricity, because that shocked people. She had moved her question from why to how. Instead of talking about why she wanted something, she talked about how she needed to get there. By talking about smaller parts of the project, she found people who would work with her. When she couldn't find engineers to make a big jump, she found engineers who would take a few small steps. Although it's usually a good idea for creative people to explain why they want to do something, if their idea moves too far from what people think is possible, it may just frighten them away. Coalitions often break up when one group is more extreme than the other groups. Occupy Wall Street started in 2011 to argue against the unequal sharing of money across the United States by the financial center of Wall Street in New York. In 2011, most Americans supported the coalition, but support started to fall as some groups in the coalition became too extreme. Sergio Popovich has suggested that the movement's mistake was to use the word Occupy in their name, which was about people camping in the streets outside of banks and financial businesses. Although many people approved of the general goals of the movement, they didn't like the idea of occupying a place because it was too extreme. In the women's suffrage movement, something similar happened. Anthony and Stanton built a coalition with George Francis Train in 1867. Train was popular, but he was strongly against giving African American men the right to vote. It was a dangerous coalition that didn't work. The state of Kansas was close to approving women's suffrage, but failed. And African American men didn't get the right to vote in Kansas either. Later, Anthony and Stanton put together a coalition with Victoria Woodhull, who was a woman with very strong views and believed that women should have the right to love who they wanted and, as she said, to change that love every day, if I please. This was too much for many people and frightened away some of the supporters of women's suffrage. Many people think that this delayed women's suffrage for 20 years. A recent study by Blake Ashforth and Peter Reingen shows an interesting thing about coalitions. For people inside a coalition, the most important people are the people at the centre of the group. For the Women's Suffrage Coalition, this was Anthony and Stanton. But for people outside of a coalition, the person they notice is the one with the most extreme ideas. In the Women's Suffrage Coalition, that person was Woodhull. Enemies are better than frenemies. In The Godfather, Part 2, Michael Corleone says, "Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer." But what do we do with people who are neither our friends nor our enemies? Usually we see people as friends, enemies, or as somewhere in between. Our closest friends support us all the time. Our enemies are always working against us. But in fact, there are also people who we can call frenemies. These are people who sometimes support you and sometimes work against you. Michelle Duffy, a professor at the University of Minnesota, did a study of police officers and how they felt supported, or not, by the officer that they worked with. Not surprisingly, negative relationships led to stress. When officers felt they weren't supported by the officer they worked with, they didn't work so hard and took more time off of work. But what happened when the police officer felt supported by the other officer for some of the time? Things didn't get better, they got worse. Negative relationships aren't good, but at least you know what is going to happen and you can be ready for it. But when you don't know whether someone will support you or not, your stress increases. In another study, Bert Uccino found that frenemy relationships like this were unhealthier than bad relationships. People with a lot of relationships that were neither friends nor enemies had higher stress, were unhappier, and found life more difficult than other people. We may feel it is better to keep away from our enemies and to try to improve our relationship with frenemies. But that is probably not the best idea. It's better to keep away from frenemies and try to turn enemies into friends. Very often, the best supporters we have are people who didn't support us in the past, but who have now come over to our side. First, when someone has always supported us, we expect it and don't think it is that wonderful. But when someone who didn't support us starts to become a friend, we like them even more. Second, they will feel the same about us. They've worked hard to beat their negative feelings about us, and now they feel much more positively toward us. Third, and most important, our old enemies are the best at persuading other people to join our movement. They felt negatively about our ideas before, so they understand the people who still feel negatively. And they know why they changed their minds, so they can explain this to others. People will listen to them because they know they weren't always our friends. When Lucy Stone, who was working for both women's suffrage and African American suffrage, walked around towns putting up posters for meetings, young men often followed her, pulling the posters down. Stone asked them if they loved their mothers. Of course. Did they love their sisters? Certainly. She then explained that in the South of the United States, African American men of their age were sold and would never see their families again. She then invited the young men to her meetings as her special guests. Some of these men helped her, and they were very useful when other young men started to make trouble. From unknown to known. In the 1990s, a group of writers suggested something that had never been done at Disney. Instead of the old stories like Cinderella and Snow White, they wanted to write something completely new. Nobody at Disney really thought it was a good idea. The story became The Lion King, the most successful film of 1994, winning 2 Oscars and a Golden Globe. Disney hoped the film would make $50 million. By 2014, it had made more than $1 billion. Early in the project, 5 of the writers had a meeting with Disney management, where they explained their story about lions. Michael Eisner, Disney CEO, Chief Executive Officer, tried to find something he could understand in it. "Could you make this into Shakespeare's King Lear?" he asked. That wasn't really possible. But then, from the back of the room, Maureen Donnelly said, "No, this is Hamlet." Suddenly, everyone understood. The uncle kills the father, and then the son has to kill his uncle. So the film became Hamlet with lions, and Disney decided to make it. Justin Berg, a professor at Stanford University, has explained that the writers had to start with the lions. If they had started with Hamlet, the story would have been too much like Shakespeare's. Beginning in a different place, with lions, made the story more original, but it provided other difficulties. With a completely original story, people very easily get lost. After starting with the original lions, the writers found that Hamlet could help them a lot. For example, they realized that they needed Simba to think about his future, as Hamlet does in his to be or not to be speech. So they wrote a new conversation in the film, where Rafiki tells Simba that he must remember where he comes from. Creating coalitions. Frances Willard became leader of the WCTU after the group began working with the women's suffrage groups. How could she link women's suffrage to the problems of alcohol, which were the WCTU's first interest? Willard didn't talk about suffrage, but about home protection. The idea of home